We at MD Coaches know that match is a stressful time. If your match results were not what you expected, you might need the time and the space to explore what's next. MD Coaches is proud to offer a comprehensive 6-week virtual group coaching program that explores your unique value and possibilities beyond the match. We're offering 4 separate rolling cohorts, Sundays, April 7 through May 12, or May 19 through June 23rd. A second option is Thursdays, May 2nd through June 6th, or June 13th through July 25th. All sessions begin at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register today at mdcoaches.store/medical-student-coaching.
We have all heard the aphorism, physician, heal thyself, and we have some sense that if we are in a space of healing from life's wounds, expectations, and our critical minds, we would not only be better off, but so would the people around us, and importantly, our patients. Healing ourselves in concept makes total sense. The challenge is, how do we do it? My guest today, Dr. Jonathan Fisher, has not only done that, he has openly and vulnerably shared his journey in service to all humanity, but especially other healthcare professionals who can identify with the personal and professional challenges he experienced as he became and then practiced as a cardiologist. His healing story is inspirational and brings to mind the following Mr. Rogers quote, which, by the way, I forgot during our interview, as you'll hear. Discovering the truth about ourselves is a lifetime's work, but it's worth the effort. Dr. Fisher is a practicing cardiologist in a healthcare system in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he also has a leadership role in teammate well-being. That's only the start, though. Jonathan has inspired a global assemblage of over 1,000 healthcare professionals whose goal is to end physician burnout globally. The first global summit on the subject was in the middle of the pandemic, and participants and presenters alike continue the work. Dr. Fisher is also the author of the just-released book, Just One Heart, A Cardiologist's Guide to Healing, Health, and Happiness. Well, this is an excellent framework for people to put pieces of their lives back together, or to put it another way, a guidebook for physicians to heal themselves. Jonathan is a good friend, and the discussion that follows is not too dissimilar from our conversations in real life. There are many, many pearls here. I personally had to listen twice to glean Jonathan's impeccable wisdom and ability to translate it to living a more whole life. I invite you to listen especially for Jonathan's discovery of learned helplessness and how this was driving his unhappiness, how powerful being truly honest with ourselves is in transforming our lives, and his ABCs for approaching living with difficulty. I hope you enjoy it, and I also look forward to hearing your comments about the show at the MD Coaches Facebook page. There are times in our lives that change the way we see the world. Navigating these challenges can take insight, trusted confidants, or even a coach. Let's explore those moments. In this companion podcast to RX for Success, we will discover ways to learn and write our own success stories together. I'm Dr. Dale Waxman, a physician coach with MD Coaches, and this is Life-Changing Moments. So, Dr. Jonathan Fisher, welcome to Life-Changing Moments.
Thank you, Dale. I've been looking forward to talking with you, being with you, sitting with you.
Well, it's great to be with you, Jonathan. And as I mentioned in the introduction, Jonathan is a friend. We've had lots of conversations about lots of different things that we have in common. And today is an opportunity for to talk about something that I don't think we have talked about. And I invited you so that we could go hear some stories behind some stories. And we'll get into that in just a moment. But first, before we hear stories, I just wondered for the audience if you could share something about what you're about professionally right now.
I have 3, I would say, activities professionally. One is what I've been doing for 25 years, which is I'm practicing medicine. I'm a cardiologist with a large healthcare organization. I'm non-invasive cardiologist, so a lot of patient interactions, diagnostic testing, treatment plans. And I spend a good part of my time working as an organizational well-being and resiliency leader. So we have a team of 38,000 employees, and we have 2 physicians on a team of 5 looking after the holistic well-being of the workforce, which has just been incredibly rewarding. And I've been doing that for a little over 5 years. And most recently, and this is part of the long-term plan, I've carved out 1 day a week for myself, where I work for myself. And in that capacity, I focus on physical and mental fitness. I take care of my 3 teenagers. I spend more time with my wife. And I also just launched my first book after 2 years of work called Just One Heart. And so that allows me to have amazing conversations like this one and to go on a book tour. So that's my life right now in a nutshell.
Yeah, and there's a lot in what you just said that we could spend a lot of time in each one of those dimensions. First of all, I did not know, Jonathan, that you have that 1 day for yourself, and I'm proud of you for carving that out, because I know that's something you've thought about for a while.
Thank you, Dale. That's hot off the presses. That was contractually to start on April 1st, and so that just started. And if I look back in my notes, I have an Excel spreadsheet where I visualized and essentially, some people would say manifested this, but I looked at my life and I tried to practice my own advice to others, which was, instead of reacting to the healthcare system and just waiting to see what changes would come down the road, I did the hard work of asking myself, well, if I could wave a magic wand, what would the ideal work week look like? And I've got a spreadsheet from a few years ago where 1 day a week was going to be mine. And I knew it wasn't going to be easy to get there. And it took a lot of negotiation, a lot of seeds planted many years ago, and setting expectations for others. And it's been quite a journey, and it's taken a lot of courage and conviction that I have one life to live. And I essentially lived it for the healthcare system for at least 20 years. And I promised at one point that I would no longer be fully owned and operated by anyone other than myself.
There's a lot that I want to ask you about that, but what I want to just point out is, for listeners, one of the pieces that is the purpose of this program is for people to walk away, or after listening, to what are some of the ways that they might also change their lives so that they're accomplishing the goals that they have, so that they can fulfill their spreadsheet. So you just shared something that I have to tell you, in my coaching practice, a lot of my clients, I think they dream about, but they don't necessarily think is even possible for them.
Yeah, it's funny, dreams, and whether or not dreams come true. And when I say a dream, I mean a potential future that is achievable and has, the reason we call it a dream is because there's lots of obstacles in the way, not because it's a fantasy. And so for me, Dale, the reason I was able to dream big, essentially, is one, I got encouragement from some friends. I found myself drawn to people like you who had a sense that life could be whatever you wanted to make it, and we didn't have to live as victims of any organization or system or process. And we're really living privileged lives in a way, many of us, not all of us. And with that privilege, we tend to forget that we have agency in our lives. And I'll never forget that when I was really struggling, I was owned by a system, and I saw this book called by Martin Seligman, a psychologist, and he talked about this idea of learned helplessness. And this was it was a shot in my head. And he's saying that I learned to be helpless. I didn't used to be. I used to be a kid who would, if I wanted to be the captain of the chess team in high school and the captain of the wrestling team at the same time and be a nerd and a jock, I could do that. And all of these limitations about what I could or couldn't be started to feel more and more oppressive. I took on the mantle of a doctor. I took on the mantle of a cardiologist. I took on the mantle of all sorts of things. And what I realized after that didn't work anymore, I felt so confined in my life, is that I wanted to resist labeling, resist boxes in my employment and other places. and really recognize that any obstacles of what I couldn't achieve, most of them were mental. And so learning to be optimistic. And there's one other phrase that someone shared with me as I was telling them. They said, well, what do you want for your career? And I said, well, I really just need a little more time and space to be creative and do things that I really, really love. And he said, well, that's possible. And I said, but how? How is it possible? I have a contract. No one else has done this before. Everyone's going to think strange things about me if I say that I want to work a little less. And he said to me, the answer to how is yes. It was a new way of thinking in that moment. I realized all the times that I had made excuses for why I wasn't going to try to achieve something, or try to make a difference, or try to break the mold in a sense, because I was always a rule follower and a people pleaser. And suddenly someone told me that it was just my own habit of saying, no, that's not possible, that was preventing me from blinding me from seeing this future spreadsheet where I had essentially one day where I could pursue my own dreams outside of anyone else's.
Hi, I'm Rhonda Crow, founder and CEO for MD Coaches. Here on RX for Success, we interview a lot of great medical professionals on how they grew their careers, how they overcame challenges, and how they handle day-to-day work. I really hope you're getting a lot of great information. But if you're looking for an answer to a specific problem, management or administration challenge, or if you're feeling just a bit burnt out, like maybe you chose the wrong career, well, then there's a faster way to get the help you need. No, it's not counseling, it's coaching. RX for Success is produced by MD Coaches, a team of physicians who have been where you are. I know you're used to going it alone, but you don't have to. Get the support you need today. Visit us at mymdcoaches.com to schedule your complimentary consultation. Again, that's mymdcoaches.com, because you're not in this alone.
We'll get back to our interview in just a moment, but right now I want to tell you a little bit about Physician Outlook. If you haven't discovered this remarkable magazine, please do so very soon. It was created by physicians, for physicians, to showcase the intersection between clinical and non-clinical interests, whether it's writing, painting, cooking, politics, and dozens of other topics. Physician Outlook gives a physician perspective. It's available online and in print. It's really unique among physician lifestyle magazines. And like the Prescription for Success podcast, Physician Outlook amplifies the voice of any physician who has something to say. It also engages patients who still believe in physician-led, team-based care. And Prescription for Success listeners can get 3 months free when you enter our promo code RX for Success and select the monthly option at checkout. That's a really great deal on this stunning publication. And now let's get back to today's interview.
The title of this podcast is Life-Changing Moments, and you've just mentioned 2 already, which we didn't even talk about prior to this. But, those are really, I just want to highlight those. So, one is this idea that the answer to how is yes. And the other one just escaped me, but it was prior to that, this...
learned helplessness?
Yeah, the learned helplessness. And I venture to guarantee that especially physicians who are listening to this can identify with both of those, with that sense of learned helplessness and also that sense of lack of agency. And awesome that you have moved through those and advanced yourself to where you are. And therein lies where I want to kind of take our conversation. You've already mentioned that a lot of your work locally, nationally, and internationally, you didn't mention that you were the person that put together the first global summit on burnout in healthcare. And really, the really was about the opposite, which is how do we achieve well-being for healthcare professionals. That was during the pandemic, which is an incredible feat all by itself, while you're working full-time at that time. There's a dedication to healthcare professional well-being. And what I'm interested in, Jonathan, is there a moment or a collection of moments in your life that you can go back and say, this was that inflection point that began me down this journey towards what I'm now doing? Because I'm guessing when you were a resident and a fellow in cardiology, this is not necessarily where you saw you would be. Yeah.
No.
Is there a moment or moments?
As we put it in this context, the context that you mentioned, that Ending Clinician Burnout Summit and Global Community, where we had 1,000 clinicians from 43 countries in 2020, where I spoke with Arianna Huffington and other world leaders. And this is ongoing. And we have one event per year. We have online, and we'll be having live events as well. If I think about what gave me and gives me energy to do these projects outside of work, so nights and weekends, it happened in dealing with grief. This was my response to grief. So on the one hand, a lot of the fuel for why I'm trying to make things better for healthcare providers came from the loss of my sister, Andrea, a little over 10 years ago, and really feeling completely unmoored when that happened, and felt a sense of direction and purpose in my own life. It was like I was floundering, and I was living accidentally and very passively up until that point. And I think really it took me reading a book that explained this idea that in the many ways we deal with grief, one stands out, and that's finding some meaning in the sadness and in the loss, or more than some meaning, and finding some purpose where we either pay something back or pay something forward after someone is lost to honor their legacy. So I think that was part of it, Dale. And then the other piece was I've always been a bit of an overachiever, and there's certainly been a dark side to that. By that, I mean I'm one of 7 children. My father is a physician, and my mother is a physicist, and that was in the 1950s, before women were physicists, and they really prized achievement. It was not spoken loudly, but it was understood that in my family, and I hate to say this out loud, that in a sense we were judged by our achievements. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say I hate to say that is that there are different ways to praise children, and we can praise them for their intellectual prowess. It's also, as I've discovered as an adult in my new family, it's also possible to praise children for their ability to feel feelings and to express them and to love. And that wasn't something that was prized growing up. And so if you're asking me the question of why I'm doing this work, why I created this community, why I wrote this book that is just launched, a lot of it is driven by a fire that was set a long time ago. And some of it was because I was a natural achiever and I almost didn't know another way. It was hard for me not to do that, not to do more and more. It also comes from a desire, again, I'm just being honest, a desire for validation and approval, which I have to really watch out for. Because if I'm not aware of that, I find myself working harder and harder on projects. And this is how I was as a cardiologist for decades. I was working harder and harder, and some of it was just for the cachet or the approval. Now, most of it was for all the positive, fluffy kind of storefront window reasons, like, oh, I just want to help people and I want to do good. And what I'm interested in this stage of my life is trying to be more honest about what are the real reasons why we do what we do, and really finding those reasons behind the reasons that may drive us to work too hard or not work hard enough. So it really was a sequence of events of, I think, looking back, being raised as an overachiever who also wanted recognition and praise, and then losing the person that was closest to me in my life, which was my sister, who was a guide for me, and realizing that I didn't feel connected to my cardiology practice. I was miserable. I hated going to clinic. I felt like nobody knew who I was behind the mask that I put on each and every day and went in to see my patients. I was pretending, and it shook me up. It shook me up for about 4 years as Andrea was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor and eventually died in 2010. And that was when I began this process of putting together the pieces of myself. And one of those little lines of glue where I put myself together was this idea that I would then pay it forward and do things in service of others instead of just focusing on quote unquote self-care, but really now moving on to leaving a legacy and making her proud and making myself proud, essentially.
And we're all benefiting from that. I wonder, Jonathan, if we can deconstruct that just a bit more. I realize that your sister's illness and eventual death was a process. It wasn't an event, and it's still a process in a lot of ways. Tell us a little bit more about this shift that occurred within you that started, I'm guessing, sort of made you question, or become more aware of what you were doing with your life.
Yeah.
And then I'm guessing, and you'll tell us, that here's what I'm doing with my life. It doesn't feel like me, doesn't feel wholly me. And then there's this shift that occurred. Yeah. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, the shift happened when Andrea shared her diagnosis back, I think it was 2006 or so. And she explained that after having some blurry, and again, Andrea was in her early 40s. She had a newborn son. She was married in New York City, and one of 7 children. She was one of my 3 older sisters. And among the 7 children, I think we would all agree that she was she was a physician, a radiologist, and ironically, she read her own brain scan, which showed the tumor itself.
Wow.
And she was the one who was the deeply spiritual. So she was always looking for the connection with nature, connecting with others. She was a photographer and an artist as well, outside of medicine. And so she had this sort of ease and grace about her that I always admired, because I was the really anxious one and the restless one. And she was, in a sense, my spiritual guide. When I look back, it's very clear that I had a few, but she was the one, because we had these early conversations when I was first discovering my own anxiety in college and what eventually was diagnosed as depression. I was very reluctant to seek help. Now, that wasn't an okay thing where I come from. It was not a good look for a Harvard medical resident to talk about his anxiety. So she saw that this gap between who I was pretending to be for my patients, which was this high-achieving, had-it-all-together, brilliant doctor, was very far away from the kind of crumbling, almost insecure, sad, immature person who would just cry to her and tell her that my life didn't make sense, and I didn't quite know why. And so she asked this weird question to me, and this is long before anyone talked about self-compassion and these practices. And I'm sure she never read anything about it, but she was intuitive, and she asked me, "Can you be kind to yourself?" And that shocked the heck out of me. I didn't essentially know what she meant, but instantly I knew what she meant. And I never had realized how mean I was about this voice in my head that I had developed and honed to kind of whip me to move forward and to do more. It was just cruel in a way. The way that I treated myself, I was spending all my time with the person in my head who was really kind of mean, a taskmaster. And so when she asked me that question, she then later on, as I talked more with her, she said, well, maybe it's time to get some help. And it was really my sister who encouraged me to go to therapy for the first time. And I'm sharing this story for a very specific reason, Dale. I just want to be clear about that. And I'm sharing it because I wonder what my life might have been like if someone had held my hand and said it was okay to get help years before I finally got it. And I wonder what the people around me's lives would have been like. My friends who didn't quite understand why I wouldn't go to parties, relationships who didn't fully understand why I was afraid to commit to them. And I had a lot of work that I hadn't done. And if I had only had a therapist or a coach earlier on, and so I'm sad in a way about the time that I feel was lost. And then my mind kicks in and I reframe that and I say, well, on the other hand, I wouldn't be able to share this story for people who may be unsure of whether to get help. I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be able to tell it vulnerably and openly if I haven't lived through it. And in a sense, I feel like it's my obligation because I know there are people listening, doctors, nurses, leaders, who maybe could use a little bit of help. And were taught either by their family, their parents, their teachers, or our society, that there's something wrong with you if you ask for help, whether it's, again, coaching or therapy or whatever it is, or take a medicine for a mental health illness. There are so many obstacles, and if I can be a small part of this conversation of helping people get past those obstacles so they can live incredible lives, that's why I said yes when you said, would you talk to me about these things? It's the only reason.
And it's much appreciated, Jonathan. I know as clinicians, it's very common for us to advise our patients things that we find ourselves not doing for ourselves, right? So I'm guessing that even at that time, you'd had patients that you, or friends, colleagues, is maybe you should get some help. But we some of the last person that we often see could benefit from that as ourselves, especially if we are high achieving, and especially if we are living a script, as you've talked about, where that's not part of it. That's the other people who go to therapy, but you're talking about the benefit for you. And I wonder, you've already mentioned some of the things that emerged out of this. Can you say more about what kind of, if you can recall, what were some of the key pieces of waking up to yourself as a result of the therapy process?
Yeah.
What came into your awareness that wasn't there before?
As I think about the answer to this question, my instinct, and this I think is a common instinct, is to say, well, here's what I did for myself. I read a book, I exercised, I did all these things for myself. And I really want to emphasize, Dale, that the only reason that I was able to do this work, and I'm still doing the work, is because I had to shift my mindset from I can do it myself to I don't exist without you. I can't be whole without the people around me. My life is only as rich as my relationships. And for me, that was a radical shift, not because I don't like people. In fact, I love people. I love all people. I have a deep sense of our common humanity. And yet, if you asked me 10 years ago, you would have gotten exactly the opposite impression. So I think the unifying answer, and there's a lot of work that I'm happy to share around mind-body work, yoga, tai chi, meditation retreats, reading literally more than 100 books on positive psychology, mindfulness, meditation, you name it, anything in the self-help aisle that could help me. And at the same time, reading hundreds of medical articles about how modern science is showing that our mind affects our physical health. And then just testing the water. So part of my healing process was starting to share. I know I'm giving a lot here, but it's kind of you open the floodgates, Dale.
Well, it sounds like this experience with your sister opened you up to what else is possible for you.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
It really did, and I would add one thing. It broke me open. It broke me open. The scene was the New York City apartment, Upper West Side of Manhattan, 106 in Riverside. At that time, I was working at Mount Sinai Hospital. I would get up at 4 in the morning or 4:30 to start rounding across town at Mount Sinai on 30 to 50 patients all day long. It was just, I was miserable and exhausted. And we had a newborn, and my sister was dying. And there was just a moment where I felt like there was no way to move forward. And I was curled up in a ball on the wood floor of that apartment with my wife standing over me as I was crying. And there was no more of the old me in that moment. There was no more of the old me. There was no ground that I could rest my feet on in that moment. And so it broke me in a sense, and I had to open up. I was fortunate that I had friends who could see me suffering and wanted to help me. And so the reason that I could do the work is I had people supporting me. So lucky. Not everyone has that. And I had, so the work began by reading about Buddhism, of all things, which I knew nothing about. And this Buddhist nun named Pema Chodron wrote a book called When Things Fall Apart. And there was a section in that book which just stands out like a lightning bolt for me. As I was grieving my sister, as I had no sense that my life as it was could go on, Pema wrote, "Your suffering will only begin to disappear." So that got my attention, and your suffering will only begin to disappear when you give up all hope that there's anywhere to hide.
Wow.
And I had been hiding from a lot of bottled up pain on the inside for more than 30 years. And I had done a good amount of work with therapy, thank God, years before. And then I was broken wide open and desperate, really desperate to find a new map forward, to a way to live the rest of my life, whatever's remaining, and not in a reactive way where I would seek approval from others and go to the best schools and look like a good doctor. That wasn't working anymore. There had to be a different way.
Are you a doctor struggling to provide the best care for your patients while dealing with financial and caregiving matters out of the scope of your practice? Do you find yourself scrambling to keep up with the latest resources and wish there was an easier way? Then this virtual caregiver conference resource will save you time, money, and sanity by giving you all the resources and information your patients need in one place. This conference helps you and your patients enlist the best strategies around healthcare resources and the best financial steps for your patients while navigating caregiving situations. You don't have to go home feeling frustrated and helpless because you couldn't connect your patients with the best services. Find out more at jeanniedoherty.com or click in the link in the show's notes. You don't want to miss this caregiver resource.
Quite a process, and we're talking, and you're alluding to the process is still unfolding. This is not an event. Therapy is not an event, and I just want to make sure that you're saying that, and our listeners are hearing that too. That we continue. I think it's a Mr. Rogers quote: "Is the process of self-discovery is." I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's a great Mr. Rogers quote. I'll see if I can get it before we publish the podcast.
Yeah.
The Mr. Rogers quote about the journey of self-discovery is we never really arrive, but it's an enjoyable journey. Something like along those lines.
Yeah.
But it's an important journey. I wonder, Jonathan. Thank you so much for sharing pretty candidly what you were going through and what a lot of our colleagues also go through, perhaps not with as much amplitude, and some of our colleagues with even more amplitude than what you've experienced. But you're being vulnerable here and letting us know, here's how I experienced it and here's what I did about it, being broken open and seeking assistance, not just with a therapist, but also what does some of the wisdom traditions tell us about these moments. I wonder, if I want to fast forward us right now into the work that you're doing, predominantly in your work around healthcare professional well-being, what are you taking from your experiences of your own journey of growth, and how do you use that to assist other healthcare professionals in a very direct or even indirect way?
The answer comes from, this is now thanks to Brené Brown. So, one of the many self-help books that I alluded to a minute ago, it was on Daring Greatly, and many other books by Brené Brown. And as I was looking about how I was going to put my life back together, she said, well, it helps if you share your process of healing with others. It helps if you share that with others. Don't keep it to yourself. And I'm not saying about dumping our sadness onto others and throwing that at people's feet. That's not what I'm referring to. It's this idea that the healing happens when we open up about what we've gone through and what's worked for us, because then we're paying it forward. And that became part of my process of healing. And that began in 2012, just 2 years after Andrea died. After 2 years, so long story short, I dove deeply into the field of positive psychology, going on retreats, learning how to practice visualization and using all the tools of positive psychology from Martin Seligman, and then going on yoga retreats and meditation retreats, longer and longer, eventually week-long, sitting in silence at a Buddhist monastery, and then traveling to Oxford in the UK and spending a week there in meditation. So I'm compressing a lot of this sort of internal work. And the way that I'm able to now share with my colleagues is I started, as I was doing the work, I would show the work to others, share it. So in 2012, I decided to present a medical grand rounds to my hospital on this crazy thing called mindfulness. Now, I'm laughing because mindfulness now is not crazy. It's 2024. But in 2012, there were maybe 1,000 Google searches on it and less than 100 on the connection between mindfulness and cardiovascular disease, which was my area of expertise. And I just had this weird sense, Dale, that either I was onto something or we were onto something, that there was a healing power that of mindfulness that I wanted to now bring into the Western medical system. And then later I found out it has so many applications beyond healthcare in terms of being a better leader, being a better friend, et cetera. And so in 2012, I presented to a room full of doctors who looked at me kind of funny, like, who is this guy? He's a little bit of a weirdo, like a nut. And I expected that. And part of my process of healing was learning to be okay being judged by others as different. Mm-hmm. The reason I did so well in my medical school and in my training is that I learned, like in that Robin Williams scene in Dead Poets Society, where everybody starts walking in their own natural pace. And then what happens after a minute? All these boys, they start walking in sync. And in a sense, it's a beautiful thing, like having this community where we all have this shared bond, this experience. But on the other hand, there's something very telling and sad about what happens to us as doctors. We follow this march step so tightly that we lose our own rhythm. And as a cardiologist, I gotta make my own rhythm. So that was, again, 14 years ago. And after a few years of, I would say, close to 40 of those projects that I did on my own for free in my spare time, giving programs and talks and teaching people about what I was learning, people at the highest levels of my organization, and we have a big multi-state organization in North Carolina with 38,000 employees, the well-being leader got wind of it and said, "Hey, what you doing over there? What are you doing?" And, he said, "I hear you're doing programs with the presidents of our hospitals who are asking you about happiness and well-being at work. You want to come and work with me?" And that was about 6 years ago. And then I stepped into a whole new arena where it's not just helping my clinic and leading stress management sessions for my office staff, which I do every couple of months. Now it's how do we do this at scale for 38,000 employees in a large medical system? And that really lit me up. Once I stepped into that field and had the opportunity to help people across a system, 50% of whom were burning out, stressed out, anxious, 5 to 10% had some degree of depression that was either diagnosed or not. And now I remember myself 20 years ago in the same position, but I was all alone. And it just gives me such a sense of purpose to have the privilege to do that work so that fewer people have to suffer. And these are good people. These are people who are out there trying to help others. And I just want to remove the obstacles and help doctors and nurses live great lives.
You are opening other people's, perhaps their floodgates too. Maybe they're not floodgates, but you're helping people open gates by sharing your story, by developing programming in your healthcare system that people can access some of the tools and skills that you've developed over the years that helped you. I wonder, Jonathan, if there's a listener out there who's not a part of your system, who is struggling. Is there anything that you haven't said yet that you would impart to that listener or listeners about some steps forward that they could do for their own well-being if they are struggling in similar ways that you had been?
How much time do we have? Well, Dale, the answer is yes. And the answer is I knew a few years ago that this question was going to come up and that I could touch only one person at a time for a few minutes at a time. And I wanted to help more. So I started writing a book. And now, even before my sister was diagnosed, I was journaling on a regular basis. And then I discovered from positive psychology this practice of gratitude. And then, again, this practice of visualization. So over 10 years, I wrote several thousand notes to myself about every step of the way. And then as I started doing this work at scale, I decided that I wanted to write it down so that if someone said, how does somebody get started who's at some stage on this path of either full burnout to I'm loving my life as a physician, and I wanted to get even better, I didn't see that book out there. I saw books on stress, books on positive psychology, but that didn't help me. That's why I needed to buy more than 100 books. And I had to figure out, well, which book do I need today? So I wrote a book. It's called Just One Heart. And it really has the intention of helping people. This is not just for healthcare, but it's for our patients and just the lay public, helping people who are on this spectrum of well-being, somewhere on the spectrum, and giving, in a sense, a stepwise process, but more of a framework, a way of putting the pieces back together in their lives. And so that's the short answer is, if you pick up a copy of Just One Heart, you'll see what I mean. The slightly longer answer is a piece that I discuss, which is an approach to dealing with difficulty. And I had to make it stupidly easy for me to remember, and it's just ABC. Anytime I'm having a difficulty. For me, it was often I would be paged in the middle of the night on call, 2 a.m. I'd have to tell my wife I'm headed back to the hospital. I would be grumpy and cursing as I'm driving down the highway. Why do I have to go back in? And I'm exhausted and I have to work tomorrow. And just a flood of negative emotions that were really not pleasant. And so the ABC approach to any challenge in life, A, is don't do what we normally do, which is to say, I don't want life to be like this. So A is about acceptance, accepting things as they are in the moment, and just don't make them worse by adding frustration or resentment or cynicism. So, and we know from the work of humanistic psychologists like Carl Rogers that talked a lot about the power of acceptance. And we also know ACT therapy or ACT therapy is one of the sort of fourth wave of psychotherapy. It's also used in coaching. It's rooted in acceptance. So we have to practice A first, and then we can move on to B. Once we have gotten over fighting with life, B is about balance. Okay, well, how do I balance my thoughts? And this gets back to what we were talking about before, this idea of learned helplessness. Aaron Beck developed cognitive behavioral therapy, and Martin Seligman then borrowed some of his techniques and helped people reframe pessimistic thoughts or pessimistic thinking into more optimistic thinking. And so B is a way of reframing our thinking and recognizing with humility that just because a thought comes from our own mind, it isn't always correct. And that was a radical realization for me, by the way. And that was only because I started practicing meditation, that I could experience myself not as a unified whole, as a being with his own thoughts, but instead I became a consciousness that was simply aware of thoughts emerging from the mind inside the same body, which is, it sounds weird and hippy-dippy, but essentially I started experiencing myself as Dan Harris, the news reporter who wrote a book called 10% Happier, put it. I was able to get out of the waterfall of my life and step back behind the ledge and just see the water flowing instead of getting swept up. And that's the B practice. And then C is the fun part. C is where my life really was like, and I hope it's okay, but I'm sort of sharing with you the resources that helped me along the way. I read a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which I swore that I would never read because it sounded so cheesy and blah, blah, blah. But it actually is a great book. And one of the messages of that book, one of the habits of, quote, effective people is they decide in advance what's going to make their life good, what the victories are of each day. What are the 3 victories we're going to have? And so for me, that's the C of dealing with life. So A is we accept whatever difficulty we have. B is we learn to balance whatever overwhelm we are feeling. And C is cultivation, cultivating like the flowers that are growing in our garden right now. We know from the happiest people in the world, happy people experience positive emotions. There's no way around that. And I was someone who had not experienced but a handful of happy emotions, deeply experienced them for many, many, many years. And so after Andrea died, I decided that I was going to imagine a life, create a life that was filled with as many of the, and this is why you and I are friends. This is why I love being with you. I get these feelings when I'm with you. So you're part, you don't know it, but you're part of my C. You're part of the cultivation. And so that's what I would advise someone who's coming for the first time saying, where do I start? Start with acceptance and then learn a way to balance and reframe and then recognize that you're not helpless here. You can cultivate the life that you want.
Well, Jonathan, you're my C too. So thank you for that part of my cultivation. So thank you for the opportunity to share that. What I'm hearing you say is I'm inviting listeners who are looking for, I'm feeling stuck. I may be disillusioned. I may be somewhere on this continuum of thriving versus surviving or burnt out, closer to the burnt out edge. What are some first steps? And what I'm hearing you say, just to summarize of all the things we talked about, one is your ABCs. And we start with acceptance, looking for balance and reframe, and then cultivation of some positives. And so we all can do that regardless of where we are on that path. The other piece that I heard, your book that's just come out, Just One Heart, is also a guide. It's a resource to really deeply explore some of these issues for people. And then the other part is for people who really don't have the resourcefulness to even do those two things, is that get help sooner and share that with others and bring therapy or coaching into your life to get you started. And so we're not wishing on people that they have to have a significant loss like you experienced that triggered you. But there are resources and there are ways out there to begin that self-exploration. And I hope I'm summarizing this well. And if there's something that I'm missing, please add to that right now as we kind of close down our conversation.
Dale, this is from the first time we met. You did something that I was caught off guard by, and you just did it again. After we spoke for about an hour and a half, you said, so now let's just sort of look back at what we just talked about. And what are you going to take away from this conversation? I thought, what an odd thing to ask somebody. And now I just think it was the coolest thing, because it's like we have these moments in our lives. And this is right now, this is a moment that we have. And what you're doing is you're acknowledging that our memories are frail and we're not going to remember it all. And you summarized beautifully what I was sharing. I would bring back one other piece of the story that I would want to pass along. And this is, again, not only to honor my sister, but to share the essential, the most important piece that helped me, which was this idea, can I be kind to myself? And for people who may be listening, who are feeling burned out or stressed out, I know for a fact there's also some element of shame. Not wanting people to know, feeling like a failure, what's wrong with me? And I just want to say that we have to get past that. We have to stop beating ourselves up. We have to recognize that we have a critic in our heads, and we can't get very far unless we do the work, and I discuss this in the book, do the work of transforming that critic into not just an accepting presence in our lives, but a loving friend. Through thick and thin, through all the crap that we may be going through, what's it like now to live life with your best friend with you all the time, who's got, it gives you a shoulder to cry on and a hand on the back and a big smile and a thumbs up when you do well. Gosh, what is life like when you are your own best friend? And that's a really important piece for how I got started on this journey. And I try to remind myself, I forget a lot, Dale. And I still hear that old voice of criticism coming in. And remember that unless I can be kind to myself, it's really an uphill battle.
Jonathan, I feel like we could talk all day, as we have, in person in restaurants and coffee shops. And we also need to bring the podcast to a close. And I love the way that we are closing, which is befriending self and what's life like to go hand in hand with your best friend, and your best friend is you. And I love that idea of cultivating that sense as a way of people continuing to coach themselves as well, going through. So Jonathan, thank you so much for being here and sharing your story, which I believe will resonate very well with many of our listeners. And thank you for sharing yourself more locally, nationally, and internationally. For our listeners, in the show notes, you'll find a link to how you can connect with Jonathan's book and pick that up. I've read it. It's amazing. It's awesome. There's a lot, no pun intended, there's a lot of heart in this book about heart. And so, Jonathan, thank you once again for being on Life-Changing Moments.
Dale, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for all that you do and who you are in the world. You're doing such good for so many people, and I'm happy to be a very small part of that.
Thank you for tuning in to Life-Changing Moments. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to rate us 5 stars and leave a review. Doing so helps our podcast reach more listeners. Have something to share? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Visit the MD Coaches community on Facebook groups. This dynamic virtual space is a place to continue discussion about life-changing moments and perhaps share some life-changing moments of your own. Join the conversation today.